Shalom! Welcome back to Understanding the World with Rabbi David Kaufman. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein, and shortly we'll be joined by Richard Miniter, New York Times bestselling author and a columnist, foreign policy columnist for Forbes magazine. So, Mark, let's talk a little bit about what's going on with Iran.
Okay, from what one can read, the negotiations are going full force now between the allies, essentially, and Iran. And there's some speculation that a resolution will meet whatever deadline in July 20th, something like that. That's speculated. And the discussion then becomes what would constitute a good resolution as opposed to one that would open up more cans of worm than not. And so obviously the good resolution would be one that would dismantle part of the process that Iran is building and not simply let it in place, because as the theory goes, if it leaves it in place, then it puts the onus on inspections and very, very detailed inspections of that, and which have really never predicted what was happening on the ground.
Well, and the issue with inspections, obviously, is if they're restricted to certain places, all Iran has to do is move their production somewhere else. And this is, an obvious problem that's been around for a while. This is not new. That inspectors have to have free rein in order to actually make sure that other things are not going on. And I don't know that Iran is willing to give them free rein.
Well, it hasn't in the past. It's opened up certain facilities for certain purposes for a limited time period. One of which, for instance, would be the Parchin military complex. But it's believed that certainly Iran has duplication of facilities in many different places, and the overall speculation is to, at some point, open up the negotiations to actually determine Iran's decision, what it wants to do. Once one understands Iran's decision-making and where it does want to go, one can have a better understanding of the current negotiations and what they really should accomplish.
Well, and we're dealing with a situation in which the Israelis believe that we should be combating Iranian nuclear weapons capability, and the U.S. government just wants to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon and is granting them what I would say is a lot of leash.
There's a lot of leash, and it's including the speculation of what Iran would need in terms of the number of cyclotrons and the type of cyclotrons available, and that I guess the administration is banking on the theory that Iran will not acquire breakout capabilities within between a 6-month to 1 year period. And that's, even though 6 months to a year is a long time, it doesn't seem to pass the muster as to what would be a responsible outcome of the negotiations.
Well, and 6 months, I mean, the problem is how easy would it be for the United States to get the political situation to the point where it could launch an attack? I mean, I can't imagine that it would take anything less than several months for that to even be possible.
I mean, to be cobbled together and then to have the Congress, obviously I think that the president believes that the willpower to not particularly launch an attack, but to do something of a more stringent determination would take a very short period of time.
Well, if they got an approval for Congress to use military force if necessary, period, without asking Congress, then I could see it happening.
But the first line of defense has always seemed to be the economic sanctions. The discussion has been to ratchet those up to a certain point again. And there, as well as I, it takes months to not only pass that type of legislation, but to implement it.
Yeah. And our foreign policy has seemed to be based on avoiding involving ourselves in a lot of these issues that involve avoiding sending military troops rather than getting the issues settled. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Syria right now, the Israelis have said the Syrians have used gas against their people 30 times, and since the discussion came up, since August, they've only dismantled a small percentage of their weapons. They haven't even declared much else. We don't have anything about weapon stockpiles, and our threat is gone.
Now, we don't actually know, I think, what the American people think. It's been assumed that the Americans have been war-weary, but I believe I saw a recent poll that said if America really needed to do something, that most Americans would support going ahead and doing that.
No, the question is, what does really need to do it mean? I mean, it's like, if we were attacked, would we retaliate? Yes, we would retaliate. If somebody else is attacked, would we engage? Then the question is who and how, and then maybe and maybe not. And you can't threaten that way.
Right.
And when you're dealing with, one of the advantages we've got right now is you've got Russia fighting on multiple fronts too. So, potentially we're in a situation in which at this point we can say, they better back down in Syria or we're going to ramp up in Eastern Europe, which is a much bigger threat than Syria is. The Russians may have to back off on Syria if we made any kind of threat at all right now. On the other hand, the Russians could well say, if you threaten Syria, we're going to ramp up in Eastern Europe.
Well, it's right. Yeah. Now, what I'm hearing this afternoon is that Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, had participated in a webinar sponsored by the Washington Institute. And he's been quoted this afternoon as saying, Iran believes that the American initiative used to be simply to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear military weapons. And that it has shifted to where America is now seemingly saying that it will not permit Iran to have those weapons within the Obama administration's tenure.
Well, and I don't know what we deal with that. How do you make a promise that is, we promise maybe for a certain period of time as we're pushing the envelope forward, you're going to run the risk at that point of not having the reaction time available in between administrations. That's not a good thing. You don't want to have a lame duck administration that decides it's not going to launch attack for the 3 months at the end of its administration, or even the 4 or 5 months at the end of its administration,
right? Even
6 months at the end of its administration, when you got a 6-month deadline. That's
right.
Bad.
It's very bad when you compare the numbers.
That's really bad.
Yeah.
And
that's only speculation, of course. But that seems to be what is motivating the Iranians to prolong the negotiations.
Life is weird these days. Well, while we're waiting for Richard Miniter to come on, why don't we talk about the Supreme Court decision for a minute, which has nothing to do with foreign policy. I published an article on my rabbikaufman.blogspot.com blog, which you can get to from onetotalkto.com, about the Supreme Court decision. And I talked about the fact that this seemed to me to be a free exercise Supreme Court case rather than an establishment court case. And the problem is that people want to argue against the establishment issue based off of this court case. And it seems to me that there needs to be something else that's going to do that other than this court case.
Yeah, certainly we're hearing from the Jewish community especially that fear that establishment will take place if only Christian ministers are allowed to give their sectarian invocations.
Yeah, I mean, if the situation is that when you come before a city council or a state house or something like that, and the only people who are offering prayers are Christian ministers. And those Christian ministers are allowed to say whatever they want, to use Christian language, even to essentially proselytize, because some of the prayer language that's used is essentially proselytizing language. It's not just "thank you, Jesus." It's "Jesus is God's son," blah 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 blah, and all the stuff about being finding salvation through Jesus and all that. And if that's the basis of the prayer, and the only thing that changes is a few words in between about whatever they want to advocate for, you end up in a situation in which functionally not only are you establishing Christianity as the religion of the government, but you're also actively proselytizing for Christianity. And it would seem to me that regardless of the free exercise issue, at that point you're violating establishment. It doesn't really matter, especially if you do it regularly. If there's no alternative to that,
right,
you're definitely violating establishment. And this Supreme Court case, for whatever reason, they did not come out and say you can't do this because you're going to violate establishment, which is for me the solution is no, you can't necessarily tell a minister that they can't talk about their religion when they're praying, because that's the whole purpose of bringing them in there. If you want somebody to read a generic prayer, have somebody read a generic prayer. Don't ask a minister to do it. Because it's got to be a free speech issue. There's a free exercise issue. I mean, I understand that. The possibility of bringing in people to create diversity, that's a wonderful idea. I think it needs to be up to the local city council or up to the state legislature, or however you want to do it. It makes no sense to tell a city council that they have to bring in people from a neighboring town.
Well, I
don't think the court can do that.
I'm not sure that's a particular issue.
That was one of the things that was mentioned in order to provide diversity.
Well, I understand. There's different ways to provide diversity, and I would think in the lack of a suitable, diverse spokesperson for the day, maybe they would say it's better not to have any invocation than to reify the idea that there's only one religion.
Well, and so the issue is in towns where the only places within the town are Christian.
Which happens a lot in Iowa.
Well, and you also have the issue of, is it the case that Christian diversity counts as diversity? Okay, Catholics and Baptists and UCC churches and Protestant and Presbyterian churches are not the same church, and functionally, that's the kind of diversity I think that the founding fathers were talking about when they were dealing with anti-establishment.
Yeah, originally.
So the issue is, the law doesn't see Christianity as one religion. That's one of the issues that's in question here. It seems to me that you can provide diversity legally by having a Catholic priest one week and a UCC minister the next and a Presbyterian minister the next, and so that's not going to satisfy the Jewish community for sure about diversity. That's Christian diversity, but it's not broad scale diversity, and the only way to get beyond that, I think, is to say either they have to be, that these communities have to go out of their way to create a diversity that's broader than that, or the court needs to take a look at whether or not this is establishing Christianity as a religion, as the national religion.
And just to back it up one step, I don't think either you or I are offended when Christian clergy pray their own denominational sectarianism.
No, absolutely, and I actually have a problem with the courts. I have a problem telling ministers that they can't pray as they according to their tradition to begin with. I would have an issue, for example, saying, I'm inviting you to pray as a Christian minister,
but don't say anything
about Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
Because we can only allow theistic prayers here. It's worse if there's an issue of, in the context of a Jewish religious ceremony or something like that, and you're bringing somebody in who's Christian to participate, and you tell them that they can't be a Christian in the context of the ceremony. I certainly would not want to have somebody who wanted me to participate in a ceremony and say, you can't be a Jew. I mean, so,
right.
it just, I mean, yes, the Jewish God language tends to be inclusive.
It does.
But that doesn't mean that it's okay to say you have to be Jewish. You have to be Jewish in order to participate in some sort of ceremony.
Now, on the other hand, prayers and invocations have always been part of public functions in the United States. In God we trust. There's no way that that's going to be removed from the culture of the American people.
Well, I don't know that that's true. I mean, the first thing is, it's not a problem for an individual to offer a prayer, themselves. The question is whether or not it needs to be an organized group prayer, and whether or not it needs to be part of certain things.
Bring it back to something more tangible. The U.S. Congress opens its sessions with prayer.
And the question is whether or not it should.
But the cases have been established far and wide that they can. I guess there's a case in Nebraska in its legislature that says that prayer is a legitimate form of opening invocation for any session.
All I can say is if we get to the point where it's becoming very clear that everything is Christian, then it's a question of whether or not you can define Christianity as a religion. Okay, I mean
Christianity
that's the issue. as a religion,
an amalgam of all its semi-denominations.
Well, like I said, the question is Christianity a religion or is Christianity a set of religions?
Okay.
If Christianity is a religion, then regularly having Christian prayer, no matter what form you put it in, is establishment.
Right.
And that's a violation of the First Amendment, period. End of discussion. I mean, there's no question about that. If the issue is that different kinds of Christianity qualify and you're actually providing diversity, what that means is all you're doing is saying religious minorities in this country, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, don't count. I mean, that's really what you're saying. We don't respect them because they're not part of who we are, and that ends up being the extent of the discussion.
Well, what's to be done in light of the court's finding?
Well, first of all, I think that individual groups are going to respond. Okay, I think individual groups are going to modify it so that we can have diversity. Some communities may not, and I think it's to their detriment to do that. But my bet is that it's many town councils, many state legislatures will go out of their way to be inclusive after this ruling. But we'll see. We have Richard Miniter on Skype with us, and let me get my headphones in here so I can be ready to say hello. But we're joined right now via Skype by Richard Miniter, New York Times bestselling author and columnist for Forbes magazine. And Richard, we're excited to have you with us.
Well, I'm glad to be with you.
So there's a lot of different topics for us to talk about. I kind of been reading through some of the articles that you've produced over the last few years, and there's certain things that we've kind of talked about and touched on over the time on this show. There's certain things we haven't talked about as much that we're really interested in talking about, particularly Africa in general. We don't get a whole lot of discussion of North Africa and what's going on. But tell us kind of what you've been involved in lately and what's on your mind.
Wow, that's a big topic. Well, I've got a new book called Eyes on Target, which is a look at the U.S. Navy SEALs. But it's told from a totally different perspective, in that a lot of these books tend to be either autobiographies of particular SEALs or just stories of daring do from deep in the past. What we wanted to look at in this book, Eyes on Target, is how the culture of the Navy SEALs is changing in the Obama years. And given that the SEALs are the tip of the spear in the fight against terrorism in dozens of countries, including North Africa, where the United States has been waging a secret war against al-Qaeda and its offshoots and affiliates for almost a decade now. If you change the culture of the SEALs, as the administration seems to be doing, watering down the standards, expanding the number of SEALs, perhaps selecting SEALs on a quota basis, You change the culture of the organization, you change the effectiveness, and ultimately you make America less safe.
Now, so you're saying that that an organization that's functionally 1,500 active people, there are 1,500 SEALs or something, if I remember the number from your book correctly.
That's right.
That group of people is functionally our primary foreign policy implement.
Yeah, there's an incredible amount of leverage when you look at the amount of American power, right? So a handful of people have an enormous impact. It's no accident that SEAL Team 6 was sent in to kill Osama bin Laden, or to go in to capture him, and that led to his death. There are different accounts of that. But if you look at SEALs and other special forces, Special Operations Command dispatches most of the hard fighting in the war on terror. Yes, there are ground troops, U.S. Army, Marine Corps, to hold ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. But as the Obama administration has retreated from both of those countries and pulled U.S. troops out, the role of the special forces, including the Navy SEALs, the Army Rangers, the Air Force Cloud Jumpers, the Marine Special Operations, have taken a larger role. In fact, the lion's share of the fighting is done by less than 10,000 men.
Well, Richard, who is it that really commands the SEALs and the Special Forces?
Well, until recently, it was Admiral McRaven, who was at the Special Operations Command in Tampa. But ultimately, of course, the answer is the President of the United States commands the SEALs. Under our Constitution, the President is the Commander-in-Chief of all the armed forces.
And what changes have you noticed, and when did these changes start?
Well, basically, there's been a law enforcement model that the administration has applied. So they think of war fighting as akin to crime fighting. And this is actually a dangerous and false analogy. When you consider it like crime fighting, when you're fighting theft, murder in the United States, the perpetrators are most likely U.S. citizens or legal U.S. residents, and who have, or at the very least, people inside the United States, and they have certain constitutional rights. They're innocent until proven guilty. The government has to share a great amount of information with them, with their defense attorneys in order to prosecute them. And we limit what police do. We don't want the police acting as paramilitaries. But warfare is very different. And as the administration has really changed the rules of engagement for our armed forces, but especially for our special forces, making it much harder for them to go after, what they call euphemistically the bad guys. The word enemy is kind of missing from the lexicon these days. To give you a quick example, I have an entire chapter in the Eyes on Target about this. There is Carl Higbee was a member of SEAL Team 10 who made a silent vow that after those 4 Americans were hanged from the bridge in Fallujah, I'm sure you remember that haunting scene, their burned bodies dangling from chains over that bridge over the Tigris River, with the crowd, thousands of them, chanting Allah Akbar, God is great. And that, the cameras of the world feasted on that atrocity. And Higbee vowed, as did other SEALs, to hunt down the Al-Qaeda villains responsible and bring them to justice. And they finally found those guys in 2009 in the Obama years. And the mission to go get them was denied more than 10 times. A risk-averse commander was afraid that any loss of life, even enemy loss of life, might count against him for promotion reasons. The culture inside the SEALs had changed. And when they finally did, and it's an incredible story of them fast roping down from a helicopter under a moonlit sky, creeping across the lunar landscape, attacking an Al-Qaeda fortress deep in the desert, off a dirty tributary to the Tigris River, capturing the guy without firing a shot, and then running for the helicopter with their prisoner, getting safely back to base. And it should have been a triumph. Here, after more than 5 years, the perpetrators of Fallujah atrocity were in custody. And Carl Higbee went to sleep, and he was woken up a few hours later and told to report to the commander, said he was in big trouble. And the commander said, "You're going to be court-martialed." And he said, "Why, sir? It's a perfect operation. The mission was accomplished, not a shot was fired, not a person was harmed, and we got the guy. He's in custody." And the commander says, "Yes, but he has a bloody lip, and he's pressing charges." And for the next year and a half, Higbee and other SEALs had to borrow money from friends and family and hire lawyers, and they were out of the fight, and they were instead fighting in court. And ultimately, they were exonerated. But this is the kind of thing, this is the kind of change that is a major sea change inside of the Obama years, inside Special Forces. We've subjected them to a lot of legalistic concerns, which has made them less effective in fighting the enemy.
What is the purpose then of making these changes on behalf of the administration? What does the administration seek to change in terms of world outlook or relationship between the United States and others?
Well, I think the Obama administration is essentially bored by foreign policy. They understand that since they're running the White House, they have to do some of it, but they really haven't put a lot of energy into it. They want to retreat from Afghanistan and Iraq, and they've largely done so. The retreat from Iraq, of course, has put us in the United States in a much tougher position to put pressure on the Iranians to stop their atomic weapons program, which, of course, threatens Israel, but also threatens hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens who live and work in the Middle East. Some of them work and live in Israel, but they also work, across the Gulf and so on. And ultimately, the Iranian missiles will be a threat to our allies in Western Europe and ultimately to ourselves. But the administration hasn't really put a lot of energy into that. They drew red lines in the sand for Syria and then backed away from that, and so on. So all of this is part of a larger retreat from the world. I think the Obama administration really wants America to have a foreign policy closer to that of Canada or Belgium, where to the extent that we have a foreign policy, it's going to the UN to make beautiful speeches calling for human rights and writing checks for foreign aid, but not using American military might to shape the world in such a way so that it's safer for America and her friends.
So let's talk a little bit about Africa at this point. And you write a lot about Africa. Tell us what's going on in Africa, North Africa particularly, right now.
Well, I write a lot about Africa, especially for Forbes, because there's really no one in American journalism paying sustained attention to Africa. And I've been to 38 African countries. I've developed some pretty deep sources and intelligence community there. And the Arab governments, especially in Morocco, are actively fighting al-Qaeda and its offshoots. And they'd like, frankly, more assistance from the United States. Morocco is probably the Arab state that's friendliest to Israel. And they have modeled themselves to a great extent on Israel, as a broad democracy. And in fact, the former head of Moroccan intelligence said to me that Israel should be a role model for all Arab states, that if Arab Spring was really about replicating in Arabic what the Jews have accomplished in Israel, the world would be at a better place, which I thought was astonishing. Of course, he wouldn't let me quote him saying that in Forbes. But the fact that they're thinking it and talking about it's important. And I think the future of the region is important because North Africa could be the next Afghanistan, the next collection of failed states by which international terrorism uses that safe haven to launch attacks against America and our friends. Remember, the attacks on 9/11 were not possible unless al-Qaeda had a secure base in Afghanistan. And the next wave of attacks, which al-Qaeda desperately wants to bring against us, they will need a safe haven to do that. And increasingly, that looks like North Africa. And if you look at what's going on in Nigeria now with Boko Haram, which is an al-Qaeda ally and sometime affiliate, the capturing of the Nigerian schoolgirls and the series of attacks and bombings that have gone on in the last few years in that country, with very little U.S. assistance. The Nigerians have asked for signal intelligence. They've asked for drones. They get a minuscule amount is spent, less than $3 million is spent training counterterrorism forces in Nigeria, when really, that should be doubled or tripled. But there's a great hunger in West Africa and in North Africa to develop capability to fight terrorist organizations before those organizations take over those countries.
Richard, you write in one of your articles that North Africa is now home to some 15 al-Qaeda affiliates. Who are those affiliates? Are they local nationals? Are they really al-Qaeda? Or are they just have something in common with al-Qaeda?
Well, you got to remember, al-Qaeda is a part of a larger movement, right? The Salafi movement, which is sort of like, it's a movement that emerges out of the Arab world in the 1960s. And it's a reaction formed largely by the Arab baby boom. So we had our hippies and our radicals in the 60s. They had theirs. But theirs were sustained initially by Soviet intelligence and then by local intelligence services at different stages. And this movement grew and built institutions. And so Al-Qaeda is one of those. Now, what's astonishing is that when you get into these debates about whether a particular group is Al-Qaeda or not, it's not like there's a membership card. It's not that simple. It's what are the financial relationships? Do they take orders from each other? Do they coordinate? And it's amazing how interconnected all these groups are. 7 or 8 years ago, I went to an island in the southern Philippines and saw the head of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And I asked him, have you ever met, Ayatollah Khomeini? Now, this is he's a Sunni Muslim, had just stepped down from running a terror group against the Philippine nationalists, and he'd been backed by Muammar Gaddafi, another Sunni Arab. And yes, he had met the then Iranian leader, Khomeini, and it was astonishing to me. He'd met the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. I asked him if he'd met anyone from Hezbollah, and he pulled out a picture of himself playing volleyball with the head of Hezbollah, and so on. He'd met the Speaker of the House of Sudan. So here's a guy in a lonely outpost in an island, 7,000 to 8,000 miles from the Middle East, who had met, running a small terrorist group, who had met all of the important players in the sort of funding and organization of terror networks. So they're all interconnected. And when you get into debates about who directs whom, who works for whom, these are the kind of debates that rage inside the intelligence community. But what they don't want to admit is that we don't really know, because what we're looking for, when U.S. intelligence is looking for, is something akin to a foreign army, where there's a general gives an order to a colonel, then it goes to a captain, to a lieutenant, and then down to the sergeant who implements that order with a squad of men. That's not how terrorist organizations work. And so you have to look at certainly not how Salafi terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, like Hezbollah, and so on, Hamas, and so on, how they work. How they work is through personal relationships. So it actually really matters who people are married to, whose cousin they are, how they've trained together, how does money move. And the other side of the debate inside CIA and the American intelligence community about whether or not Boko Haram is an affiliate is based on signal intelligence. They're not intercepting enough phone calls to see a chain of orders going from somebody senior to someone less senior to somebody junior. But that could well be that just because the terrorist organizations have gotten smart. They certainly know from the recently released bodyguard of Osama bin Laden that the U.S. is very good at intercepting cell phones and satellite phones. And so they send couriers with handwritten messages or memorized messages. They meet in person, precisely to avoid this kind of signal intelligence that would demonstrate the chain of their organization. But they all work towards a common end. They have common funding, and they have common techniques and tactics.
Well, Richard, are you saying that at a certain level the differences between the Sunni and the Shia are less important when it comes to overall jihad?
Yes. In fact, you see, and we've seen this since the days of the Iraq War, when I spent a lot of time in Iraq between 2003 and 2008. And for example, I spent some time with the Kurdish counterterrorism force there, and they had captured Iranian military officers, intelligence officers, Iranian Revolutionary Guards in uniform inside Iraq, where they were directing Sunni terrorists. So we've seen Sunni and Shia work together towards the common aim of destroying Israel, of destroying the United States, and destroying the Western way of life. They have the same enemies. Now, maybe once they've dispatched us and dispatched our civilization to oblivion, maybe then they would fight among themselves, as we're starting to see in Syria. But in terms of functioning terrorist organizations and giving each other safe haven and access to capital and access to men and material, we've seen a lot of cooperation between the Iranians and Sunni terrorist groups. Iran's state-run radio, for example, has admitted repeatedly that it harbors some 500 al-Qaeda senior leaders inside their country. They say they're under house arrest, whatever that means, but they won't turn them over to the United States or to any Western government or even to their Arab governments, which have asked for them, including Saudi Arabia. So they seem to be free to come and go.
Let's talk about Libya for a minute and Benghazi specifically. There's a lot of discussion about the U.S. response to the attack in Benghazi and just what's going on in Libya right now.
Well, first of all, I think the Republicans have been completely boneheaded about Benghazi. They've been asking the wrong question. They're spending so much time on who wrote the talking points and who perpetrated the myth that this was driven by a internet video and was a spontaneous riot, that spontaneous demonstration that became a riot that became an attack. That's the wrong set of questions to ask, frankly. Yes, it's sort of interesting in an inside the beltway political calculation, but for America's national security, the more important question is, what about the months before? And if you talk to Libyan intelligence, as I've interviewed them, you'll discover that they had sent numerous warnings to their American counterparts about a buildup of al-Qaeda in Benghazi. And in my book, I cite 3 intelligence reports written by American intelligence agencies that were circulated inside the State Department, showing an immense buildup of al-Qaeda in Benghazi in the months before the attack. Al-Qaeda even held a parade with some 300 armed men waving Kalashnikovs out the windows of their cars and pickup trucks, with anti-aircraft mounted in the beds of those pickup trucks and heavy machine guns. They had a press conference, too, after a 2-day conference following their parade, again, in downtown Benghazi, less than a mile or a mile and a half from the diplomatic outpost where Ambassador Stevens was to die. And we've seen attacks linked to these groups. So the initial reporting was overwhelming that this was al-Qaeda based. And the Libyan intelligence, which is apparently not corrupted by the U.S. political bias as well, showed the same pattern. So the question is, how did we ignore the al-Qaeda buildup in Libya prior to the attack? And why wasn't more done to safeguard the American personnel there? Why were the security requests repeatedly turned down? And that's where you get most likely into politics interfering with national security. The Obama administration, when it was pushing for re-election in 2012, had 2 foreign policy triumphs that it wanted to trumpet. 1, bin Laden is dead, and al-Qaeda's on the run. 2, hey, we liberated Libya. We got rid of Muammar Gaddafi, and a rough democracy is being born there. Now, both of those things are true, but if they were to admit that Libya was on its way to becoming a failed state, and that following the end of the Gaddafi regime, that the transitional national government was weak, and al-Qaeda saw an opening and swarmed from Egypt and from Central Africa into Libya, and we're turning that into an important al-Qaeda base. If you would admit that truth, then you take away the 2 foreign policy triumphs of the Obama administration. Al-Qaeda is getting stronger, and they're getting stronger in the one place where they thought they'd won a victory, which is Libya. So why did politics interfere with the national security apparatus and kill 4 Americans and put more than 40 Americans in jeopardy of losing their lives, many of whom were, by the way, seriously injured? Some of the eyewitnesses to that attack had been treated at Walter Reed Medical Center for months on end. These are serious injuries.
Richard, what was Ambassador Stevens' own evaluation of the situation?
I think Ambassador Stevens, who spoke very good Arabic with a North African accent, and had good friendly relations with a number of important players in the region, but also in Libya, he saw he saw what everyone else saw, that there was a mounting al-Qaeda presence, that the threats had been escalating for about a year and a half, that the British ambassador had to leave, so did the Red Cross. There had been bombings, the number of checkpoints run by militias that would stop cars coming from the airport on the way to the U.S. diplomatic outpost there had grown. The assaults on American officials in public had grown. And there's one case in which a trade delegation was attacked by thugs and security had to fight them off. So he saw all that. He saw that pattern and repeatedly requested more security. And those requests were turned down, perhaps for political reasons.
Let's talk about another aspect of the bin Laden situation, Pakistan in general. Let's talk about Pakistan and its relationship with the United States.
I think the Bush administration made some major early mistakes with Pakistan that are going to take a long time for the United States to correct. But Pakistan should have been offered a fundamental choice. It can be an ally of the United States, and it can have a say in the future of Afghanistan, which is strategically important to it for a number of reasons. Or it can continue to fund terrorist groups to fight India and to fight us, but it can't do both. And unfortunately, this choice was never really put to Pakistan. If we're going to wage a war in Afghanistan against the Taliban, which, by the way, are a Pakistani intelligence creation, right? One of the things I think pundits have always gotten wrong is they think the Taliban are the same people who were fighting on our side against the Soviets in the 1980s. Totally different group of people. The Taliban were formed in 1994. They were formed in the Pakistani city of Quetta, which is near the border with Afghanistan. And Pakistani intelligence supplied a lot of the initial money and direction. The group in the 1980s that was fighting the Soviets were known as the Mujahideen, and they later became the Northern Alliance. So one way to understand this is that our allies never changed. The Northern Alliance have their set of human rights violations and other political problems, but they're the same group of people that we backed in the 1980s as that we back today. But if you're going to get serious about fighting the Taliban, you need supply routes through Pakistan. So the Bush administration and the Obama administration continued this strategic mistake, came to rely on Pakistani ports at Karachi and elsewhere to transport U.S. goods and to supply our troops with ammunition, with food and water, and medical supplies. And the Pakistanis have not been shy about cutting off that flow of supplies in order to put pressure on us. At the very same time, they demand all sorts of intelligence information and weapons. It's absolutely fascinating when you go to see the Pakistani ambassador. It shows you this list of weapons that he's trying to get from the U.S. government. He says to fight terrorism. I said, really? You need anti-submarine devices and deep seawater mines to fight Al-Qaeda, which doesn't have a single boat? You need it to fight India. So the Pakistanis have basically been using us for their own agenda, and we have not been clever enough to either get them to act in our best interests or to treat them as the enemy they sometimes are.
There are a number of other things just generally going on right now in the U.S. relationship, in U.S. interaction with the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the region, in addition to what's going on in Syria. I don't know which one of those you'd like to talk about first, but your choice.
Well, the Muslim Brotherhood is a big and complicated organization, right? The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is different from the Syrian branch and so on. But they all spring from the same ideology. They are in that same Salafi movement that I mentioned before, that really believes that the world can be transformed through politics, through violence. Hassan al-Banna, who's the founder of this, and there are other major thinkers, were deeply influenced by the communist thinking. So if you understand basic Marxist thinking, like there's a vanguard that has to act with violence to animate the proletariat to rise up and have a revolution to create, a global utopia, that's the same structure of thinking that you see inside the Muslim Brotherhood. They believe that the public is in a false consciousness, use the Marxist term, and that only violence and dramatic action and the imposition of Sharia law and a sort of dictatorship of the proletariat, in this case they would say a dictatorship of the righteous, is the only way to get the people to see the light and embrace their version of Islam. And they imagine a single global government run by a single caliph, a dictator, if you will, who follows Sharia law, and which all non-Muslims have, by law, secondary status. And so long before Hitler made Jews and gays and atheists wear armbands, we saw that in the 13th century, under Sharia law, Christians and Jews were forced to wear armbands and not allowed to ride horses at the same time that Arabs were. They saw an Arab coming, they had to immediately get off their horse, and so on. So a secondary status for all non-believers in Islam. And this is their vision. And one of the reasons why the Saudis backed the coup to bring down Morsi, who ran the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt, was that the Brotherhood is actually quite serious about this. They actually do believe this ideology, and they do want to impose it, and they're not shy about using force to get there, which is why you've seen the set of bombings and shootings in Egypt over the past year and a half. They think that with enough dramatic, violent action, Arabs will suddenly wake up and say, yes, this is what we want. We want a global jihad. We want a Sharia-based dictatorship. I don't think there's really any evidence that the average Arab wants these things, but most Arabs are afraid to get involved because you end up dead when you go against them.
The situation in Brunei has gained a lot of attention. Do you think many Americans now will be more hip to what Sharia entails?
I doubt it. I think the part of the problem is, and I don't want to comment on Brunei directly because I have a rule of never commenting on the politics of countries where I have not been in the last 5 years or so.
Okay.
Things change rapidly. I have not been to Brunei at all, in fact. But looking at Sharia law, just based on what I've read in the papers and what I've heard, and looking at Sharia law, I think the media sort of walls off any concern about this. So when American pundits, typically on the right, start worrying about Sharia law, they get written off as extreme. And I think it's because the wrong people have started a conversation about Sharia, and they've started it in the wrong place. I think where you have to talk about Sharia law is, do you believe in equality before the law? Or do you believe that men should inherently have more rights than women? That believers in Islam should inherently have more rights than people who don't believe in Islam or don't believe in anything? And if you're not willing to accept those two premises, then taking on Sharia law is not an act of diversity or tolerance or kindness, but it's fundamentally changing the rights between parties in our legal system. And where this becomes extremely tricky is in cases in which people of mixed religions have a child together. And in their marriage contract, as we've seen in Britain, it says that the child custody in the event of divorce will be decided by Sharia law, which means that almost 100% of the time the man gets custody of those children. So I think we should have started the discussion, the national discussion in America on Sharia, with very practical questions about real cases, rather than going back to 13th century examples, which just seem very abstract and far away to people.
Many of the United States banks seem to be walking into dealing with Sharia compliant financing. Is this a trend you're seeing, and what might it mean?
Well, they've generally liked Sharia level financing because it's a way to tap into the sovereign wealth funds of Gulf Arab states. What the Gulf Arabs are figuring out, though, is that the ways to have investments that don't involve interest tend to be less profitable. And so as budget deficits loom in Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf Arab states, they need a real return on investment. You've seen that some of the enthusiasm for Sharia finance has cooled. At the same time, you've seen Western banks, Goldman Sachs is my favorite example, that tried to float Sharia-compliant bonds in order to raise funds for themselves, discovered that that didn't turn out so well, that there were a lot of restrictions that were placed on their efforts to raise money in what's called a kirkuk, or an Islamic bond, where they had to, they were not allowed to invest in anything involving armaments, tobacco, alcohol, and so on and so on. And this long list of prescriptions, which would make it hard for Goldman Sachs to use that money and invest and get a reasonable return. And then when they did offer one on the Irish Stock Exchange, it ultimately failed and had to be withdrawn. So other than a means of getting money out of Arab sovereign wealth funds, I don't think Sharia finance, at its current stage of development, which is very rudimentary, it's not a great system for allocating capital. It's not a great system for strangers to be able to participate with each other in business arrangements, unlike, say, Western finance. And I think the sheer practical problems with Sharia finance are limiting its appeal. And I think that's largely a good thing, because if you applied sort of the same consumer rules to Sharia finance that we apply to other investments in America, the Sharia finance compliant funds would almost certainly fail.
Now, we've got about 2 minutes left, and I kind of want to just let you talk about whatever you'd like to talk about. We didn't really touch on Russia. We didn't touch on Israel and the Middle East. We didn't touch on Iran. You got 2 minutes. What do we need to know that we haven't talked about?
Well, I think we have to realize that there are still people out there who actively want to kill us. It's Al-Qaeda, but it's other terrorist groups that are eager to take their place too. And as America looks weaker in the Obama years, we're going to see more hostage situations, more bombings, perhaps more attacks on schools, both here in America and abroad. And the signal that certainly we've sent with the Russian invasion of Crimea and now with eastern Ukraine is that the Russians and their Arab allies are free to continue this sort of asymmetrical warfare against us. I'm not saying that Russia is necessarily involved in Al-Qaeda, but certainly Russia is hand in glove with Iran. And so usually national security doesn't determine who wins the White House. But I think coming up in 2016, as the American public starts to see, and God forbid there's another attack here, national security will move to the fore. And I think hopefully there's a Republican candidate who can be credible, offer a credible alternative, or a Democratic candidate. I mean, someone other than Hillary, who is not tied to this foreign policy vision, which is actually making the world a place more dangerous for America and her friends, including Israel.
Well, Richard Miniter, thank you for joining us on our show today. Next week, we'll talk on a lot of these different topics, and we'll talk a little bit about President Obama's speech to the USC Foundation and numerous other things. So thank you for joining us on Rabbi Kaufman's Understanding the World today, and we'll see you next week.